just even looking at partisan affiliation, the fastest growing political affiliation is independent. And I think that translates beyond just sort of your political party registration to sort of a spirit of independence.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. If you watch the news or if you scroll through social media, we are seemingly at a complete impasse when it comes to getting anything done politically here in the United States. If you believe what you read or what you hear on those different platforms, nothing escapes partisan politics. But then you come across the work of the Millennial Action Project, a nonprofit organization that works directly with, as you might assume based on the name, young policymakers at both a national and state level across the United States to bridge partisan divides and lead an era of collaborative governance. Through the efforts driven by the Millennial Action Project, bipartisan legislation has been passed on issues and topics as big and expansive as criminal justice reform, gun violence, entrepreneurship, technology, veteran employment, and immigration. As such, there is more cooperation happening in our politics here in the United States than we may be led to believe. And this is what I wanted to ask this week's guest, Layla Zaidane. She's the president and CEO of the Millennial Action Project, so I figure she would know better than just about anyone else. I wanted to understand from the ground level what bipartisan legislation, what bipartisan cooperation is happening that we perhaps are blind to. Maybe we're choosing not to see it, but also perhaps we're not being told that it's happening because it doesn't get ratings and it doesn't get tweets and retweets and likes and shares. In this conversation with Layla, who is an expert on youth engagement, we discuss how actually productive bipartisan partnerships on the issues affecting all of Americans can actually come to pass. I recently heard Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell say that there is far more cooperation and working together that happens in DC and in Congress than perhaps we're led to believe. From your perspective, when you hear that, is that true? Do you see that? Are we being kind of fed a lie here that things are just not happening at all? We're always at a stalemate? You tell me from your perspective.
Well, I absolutely think he's correct in that sense. We like to believe that politics in DC is blood sport and is a constant gridlock and battle that leads to really nothing. And the truth is, there are great bills that get introduced and passed all of the time that don't rise to the national consciousness, but actually make people's lives better. And it's actually those less sexy bills that often end up having the deepest impact in people's lives. And so I think he's absolutely right to say that a lot more does get done than people think. Now, the problem is some of the biggest, most intractable problems that our country needs solved, those do have quite a bit of ways to go to getting resolved. And that's sort of what makes the headlines and what most Americans tend to think of when they think about whether Congress is successful or not successful at passing legislation. But certainly while it's the minority in terms of number of bills, it's some of the biggest, most important ones that do seem to get stuck.
What are some of those, I believe you used the term less sexy bills or pieces of legislation that you've seen passed that do create, a better world for us, a better country for us to live in? What are some of the examples that you can think of there?
Yeah, I think there's, and this is something that our caucus, the Future Caucus, which is made up of young elected officials age 45 and under from both sides of the aisle. A lot of the issues that we talk about are the ones that do end up sort of being introduced and passing. And it's things that look towards what do we need to do to set ourselves up to thrive in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What is the sort of bedrock and infrastructure, not in the sort of hard infrastructure sense, but from a legislative sense, that we need to pass in order to actually make life better for people, as I said. So, one of those is just recently we had two of our young members introduce something called the Endless Frontiers Act in the House, which looks towards how the United States can remain competitive against China when it comes to R&D and innovation. That ended up being sort of integrated into a bigger bill that did pass the House, and that was, that started as a bipartisan bill. Things like that look towards sort of how can we think on a global scale and how can we think even on a really local scale about looking to the future and setting ourselves up to not be totally reactive to problems once they arise, but actually anticipating sort of where we want to go and setting up the infrastructure for us to get there.
To go back to what you said earlier, then does the big bills that would have that huge impact that are deeply partisan, how difficult does that make the work that you do with the Millennial Action Project and the Freedom or the Future Caucus, as you just described? Man, how difficult is that work for you?
Well, I think it's a blessing and a curse, because I think what it does is it creates sort of these opportunities to say, hey, well, while people are stuck on sort of this major package right now that all of America is focused on, or all of the headlines are focused on, here's 100 other things that we can actually start to advance that are not going to get you sort of maligned in the press or on Twitter, but that can actually move while everybody's attention is focused on sort of the problems elsewhere. So in some ways, it's actually a helpful distraction that helps us get some real work done in the meantime. That being said, sure, yeah, it's a huge problem to have this kind of a gridlock that creates a narrative that tells Americans and legislators this isn't possible. Compromise and collaboration is just not doable. And while we know that's not true, the power of language and the power of that narrative can be a self-fulfilling prophecy that then reinforces itself. And so to the extent that sort of rhetoric becomes reality, that's where we have to really fight against sort of entrenched notions of what we can and can't do together.
I don't claim to know a ton about it. So I preface my next question with this, or with that statement, but you mentioned infrastructure, and there is an infrastructure, a massive infrastructure bill going on, two actually taking place right now. One is bipartisan. There were groups of Republicans and Democrats that worked with the president to create, I believe it was about a $1.2 trillion bill. Layla, I was disappointed when I was so excited when that got, that agreement got reached. I was like, yes, they're doing it. It's a massive bill. And then that got attached to a much larger, very partisan bill. And that I believe was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 trillion. And I became deflated. I was like, you had the bipartisan, the working together, the collaboration, and then you attached it to this other thing that seemed to be just like trying to ram it through. That to me was disheartening. Do you see it the same way?
I think that the beauty of our Congress is that it is a deliberative body. And so it is intentionally designed to have some tension, right, between what different folks in different communities and districts and the representatives elected to serve them, sort of the push and pull of getting to a solution. That's supposed to be a tug of war in some sense, because ultimately that's how you get to the best solution, is sort of bringing all of these different perspectives together in order to have that moment of conflict, right? In order to hash out those disagreements and then get to sort of where we need to go. And I think when you look at some of the items that were attached in, right, that bigger bill, they're actually things that I think most people would get behind when it comes to things like investing in childcare and support for working families, things like investing in our energy infrastructure. And I don't think that those are necessarily on their own sort of controversial ideas. But when you package it all together, and this is sort of to what we were talking about earlier, sort of trying to do this like big, like New Deal type bill, that's when people start to sort of attach their own narrative and frame around what it is that's happening, both on, I think in this case, both on the left and on the right, in terms of really talking about like, what is it that's going on here? If you look at any one of the individual proposals, I think there's broad support actually across the country for them, but it is sort of a scary big thing when you put it all together. And that's sort of where there's a failing, is sort of once we get to that level, how are institutions enabling themselves and each other to then have the conversation, have that effective push and pull and tug of war that says, listen, we all believe this is where we want to go, but here's what we think is sort of doable at this point, and here's how we want to prioritize the stepping stones and the building blocks to get there. And we're not doing a great job of that right now.
I appreciate that insight, though, Layla, and the healthy conflict that you just talked about, that is a good thing, as you mentioned. Do you feel we as everyday Americans, do I understand that well enough?
I think that most people would say that they're generally conflict averse, like nobody. Well, that's not true. Some people wake up in the morning and they're like raring to get into a fight, and they just love the thrill of sort of a good debate and being argumentative. I would say most people prefer to not have to be in conflict with others. And it's actually pretty easy today to stay in that comfortable place where you're not forced to engage with people or ideas that make you uncomfortable. And so I think on an intellectual level, people understand the idea of engaging with diverse perspectives. But when it comes to the practice of it, we don't really give ourselves a lot of opportunity to build that muscle memory and to actually practice being in conflict and sort of understanding at a cellular level, like what it means to have a healthy conflict that resolves in sort of a productive way.
What does that look like in your perspective? What does that look like to have that practice of healthy conflict? I love how you put that.
Yeah, I think most people would think about conflict as having a winner and a loser. And I think that's probably one of the things that we're doing wrong when it comes to engaging in these difficult conversations. And so I think the first thing that we probably need to do is take winning off the table and just listen and really sort of speak, to express your perspective, to share your story, and then listen when the person that you're engaging with sort of does the same. I think about it like, have you ever been on a really bad first date where the person that you're sitting, the person you're sitting across with is just talking about themselves the whole time, and they don't ask you a single question. And it's clear that they are not there to get to know you or to form any sort of meaningful relationship. They're there to just talk about themselves. And I think it's sort of similar when it comes to conflict. I mean, I guess some dating is conflict, but when it comes to having these kinds of conversations, you can't just speak to speak. You have to speak with an intent to also listen.
Great way to put that there. What about you? How did you come to get interested in this and be involved in this? I know you have a long history of youth engagement and building up that way. How'd you come to be interested in this?
Yeah, well, so it starts all the way back. Actually, before me, it starts with my parents, who are both immigrants from Morocco and moved to New York, where they met and they had me. And growing up, we used to spend our summers back in Morocco. My whole family still lives there. And just at a very early age, I got to see other cultures, other values, and understand that different is okay. You can want different things and still be a good person or a smart person. And for me, it was it was just ingrained really early on. It was sort of the water I swam in. That was just, there were different cultures out there. And I was just about to enter high school when 9/11 happened. And that was sort of a moment where, it was like, okay, other people don't necessarily have the same appreciation for different cultures or how we engage across those lines of difference. And to the extent that cultural failing has now risen up to a systemic level where the very institutions and the diplomacy that should be keeping us safe are failing. This is a real problem. Very, very heavy stuff for an eighth grader to kind of grapple with. But I decided right then that I was going to, move to DC and study international relations and diplomacy and sort of figure out how can we better engage across sort of different cultures and different borders in an international sense. And ended up, when I graduated into a recession and took one of the first jobs. It's right, like classic millennial story, right? Like 9/11 recession. Yep. Took a role where I'm, very fortunate to have gotten with the youth engagement arm of a think tank in DC. And I started to realize that sort of the problems of the sort of cultural differences that we were so ill-equipped to navigate in an international sense were actually not limited to just engaging across international borders. There were problems that we had in our own backyard. And so doing the youth engagement on a domestic level here really showed me that I think some of those same principles about bridge building and the power of sort of both conversation and then translating some of those engagements into policy, those were really applicable here in the United States. And in particular, this focus on youth, I thought was quite powerful, because what I was discovering was that those differences could be not fully erased, but at least deprioritized when you could create a shared generational identity. And that was a really interesting unifying factor that helped individuals understand that we were in the same boat as a generation, sort of having that be the stickiness factor and not sort of our partisan identity or even our racial identity, gender, geography, all of that sort of could take a back seat or at least a passenger seat to this generational identity. And so that's how I ended up here at Millennial Action Project, really applying that same lens of grassroots organizing with a generational identity. Instead of doing it at the grassroots, now I'm doing it at the grass tops and finding ways to help create those same bonds among young legislators in hopes that we might transform not just the culture of Congress and the culture of state legislatures, but really work together to pass some meaningful policy that can have some generational implications.
I definitely want to get into what that looks like and the work that you all do. But I want to go back to Morocco with you a little bit. What as a young girl and taking those family trips to Morocco, can you point back and say these things influenced me, or were the experiences that I held on to? Can you take the rest of us back to Morocco a little bit with you there and describe what those trips were like?
Yeah. Well, they were very special for me because a lot of the friends that I had aunts and cousins and grandparents. If they weren't in the same neighborhood, they were at least in the same country. And so for me, that was really the only time to connect with part of my identity that I really didn't get to sort of express throughout the rest of the year. It's just like those summers is where I got to connect with that part of me. And so I think one of the really meaningful sort of takeaways, I guess, it's so weird to talk about like a family trip having takeaways, but one of the things that I guess resonated with me is sort of seeing this like really different, even the way my family would share meals, right? Like Friday is couscous day, and everybody would come together and sit on the floor of my grandma's house and have this giant mound of couscous, and this like really beautiful communal moment. We're like eating with our hands and just like really enjoying each other's company. And that being so different from like how I would eat dinner on Fridays at home, right? Like in New York, that's like we weren't having amazing couscous night on the regular. And so understanding that that's so different from how I live my day to day, but that's also sort of a part of my heritage, a part of my identity, a part of who I am, and recognizing, just differences like that, like, oh, that seems sort of weird to me, but just chance of being born in a different state made it so that I don't eat dinner in that way. I think those kinds of things were like really, really potent, I think, as in terms of understanding just the complexity of who people are and the different identities that they hold.
You mentioned, you 8th grade when 9/11 happened, graduated into a recession. So much has been said about the millennial generation, and now going really as a lot of millennials are starting their parenting years, having dealt with a global pandemic that forced us all to stay at home with our kids, and try to be homeschoolers. That was weird. What about the millennial generation, I guess, equipped or best prepared us to kind of begin to try and bridge these divides? Not that it wasn't happening in other generations, for sure, but what about millennials, I guess, equips us to go out and try and solve some of these big issues that you all are trying to solve with the Millennial Action Project?
Yeah, I think there's a few characteristics that I would point to. One, and you probably know this, is that just even looking at partisan affiliation, the fastest growing political affiliation is independent. And I think that translates beyond just sort of your political party registration to sort of a spirit of independence. Young people don't appreciate being boxed into a certain category or having to label ourselves between binary choices. And I think we've over sort of a generation been quite resistant, actually, to fitting neatly into sort of a preset category. I think, just to use another metaphor, I think about it as the difference between like a cable package and Netflix. And I think the way people used to operate was very much like, let's get a cable package and I'm just going to have all the channels and pay for them, and it's fine, whatever, even though I don't like half of them. And now we're a streaming generation, right? Like, we're not going to pay for a cable package if we don't want it all. I'm going to get Netflix because that's where my shows are. I'm going to get Hulu, or like a combination of Disney Plus, and and we're just I think more a la carte in thinking about how we engage with each other and with our institutions. I think that equipped young people quite neatly, right, to do that kind of bridge building in other ways, where we understand the messiness of other people and are at least willing to try to disaggregate the sort of experiences or ideas that you might hold from other assumptions that would, for other generations, maybe lump lump everything together. I think we're a little bit more nuanced in how we think about disaggregating that. And I think the other thing about young people, sort of beyond this independent streak that maybe makes us a little bit more resistant to behaving the way that people expect us to behave, is I think we're very entrepreneurial and innovative as a generation. And part of that has been by necessity, and in reacting to whether it's sort of economic realities and having to think about what work looks like and the gig economy, or just in thinking about problems that need to be solved. And again, sort of taking some of this independence and skepticism of institutions and thinking, well, how can I do things differently? And sort of problem solving outside of what the status quo has been. I think that spirit of innovation coupled with this independent streak, again, makes us really well suited to be the kind of open-minded bridge builders that lead to sort of new conversations, new opportunities, unlocking sort of new pathways forward.
Certainly millennials have been generalized as lazy or apathetic, I would call it, by other generations. Do you see that, especially politically? Do you see that there is an apathy or a laziness or a nonchalance towards politics? Has that been difficult to reach your peers or younger?
Yeah. Oh, man, don't get me started. Lazy? No. Apathetic? No. Entitled? No. None of those things are true about millennials. Of course, on the individual level, you're going to find somebody who fits any adjective that you want to throw out there. But as a generation, we just spoke about, right, the economic realities that made it so that millennials, many of them did have to move back in with family in order to survive, in order to afford student debt payments, and had to work 2 or 3 jobs in the meantime. And to me, that's not somebody who's lazy. That's somebody who's actually incredibly motivated, who's working hard in trying to get ahead. Apathetic, from a political standpoint, I think the millennial experience has been one that has been fraught with failures of institutions. Starting, even in my own personal experience, right, 9/11 being such a failure of our national security apparatus, and then the Great Recession, the banking industry, the student debt crisis, or the higher education institutions, the global health system, right, with COVID-19, and just watching our democracy fail to operate in the way that we would hope to solve these problems, or at least to address them. It has been time and time again that we've seen institutions fail. And so you see a lack of interest in participating in institutions, certainly political ones, that don't seem to be working. And you have, whether you're a politician or a commentator, I think a very common refrain is the system is rigged, or the system is drain the swamp, or the system is broken. These are all the same message that say, this isn't working. And I don't want to participate in something that's not working. I don't want to buy something that's broken. And so that apathy is actually, I think, not apathy, but it is a frustration with the status quo. And you see sort of altruism in other ways, in whether it's national service, volunteerism, donating to causes. Sort of you see sort of a desire to help other people among millennials. We just don't see it necessarily at the ballot box because we keep telling young people that it's broken.
Interesting perspective there. I love that, and feel very much the same way. So let's get into the work that you're actually doing day in and day out to not only combat some of that stereotype, but to progress things forward. What does that look like with the Millennial Action Project? And can you describe the Millennial Action Project and the Future Caucus? What are those two things, and how do they interrelate, perhaps?
Yeah. So the Millennial Action Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit And we work to train the next generation of young leaders to build a more functional democracy. And so we do that through bridge building, through coalition building, ultimately through helping them pass bipartisan legislation on issues that really matter to young people. We have a network right now, it's about 1,600 young legislators across the country, both in Congress and in state legislatures. And they primarily are engaged with us through something called a Future Caucus, which is essentially a group of the youngest legislators in the legislature who come together first and foremost just to build relationships, right? In many sort of ways, just the permission structure of being allowed to meet somebody who has a different letter at the end of their name, like an R or a D, that's tough to come by. And so the Future Caucus, first and foremost, serves as that container, as that permission structure for young leaders to start to forge those relationships with one another. And then we use the Future Caucuses to help them advance priorities that matter in their state, that matter in Congress, and to, thirdly, really do the public engagement that I think is sorely needed, right? When we tell the American public that this government doesn't work, how can we uplift the Future Caucus to actually show a different narrative and hold up examples of people who are really working together in good faith and who are actually getting things done? And so the Future Caucus is really about all of those things, the relationships, the legislation, and the public engagement that we need to ultimately build a healthier democracy.
I was reading on your website that, and I'll read it here, that you hope for a political culture grounded in empathy. What does that look like? I mean, empathy is so thrown out there so often, but in practice, in the work that you all do, what does that look like to create a culture politically of empathy?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, which is just being able to listen to other people. We hope that the existing archetypes, I think, of a political leader right now are, you're on the one hand, you can be a moral leader, an ideologue who has strong values and who won't take anything from anybody who wants to sort of take you off the path of what those core values are. And then on the other side, you have people who are willing to make deals across the aisle and who will compromise and who will probably end up with a bill that is bipartisan, but watered down and not really helping anybody. And I think the future that we envision is one in which we don't have to make that choice. And in fact, there are leaders today who don't make that choice, who are both values-driven moral leaders and also bridge builders who are open-minded and inclusive in who they engage in their problem solving. And so I think that comes from a root of empathy and ability to understand the story that somebody is telling you, the needs that they have or that their community has. Just because they're not what your needs are in that moment does not mean that they are not needs. And so sort of opening your mind while also being firm on your values is something that requires a great deal of empathy and emotional intelligence. And we hope to be able to better define what that third lane is, because right now I think language is holding us back. There's not really like a category for that archetype. But that's one in which, I think MAP would love to elevate the leaders that we're working with who really demonstrate it day in and day out.
Are you able to share the names of some of the folks in Congress who are involved with you all, that you're seeing them carry this out through the work that you do?
Yeah, so in Congress, just shout out to two people in particular, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs out of California and Congressman Blake Moore out of Utah. And they're both the co-chairs of the 117th Congress's Future Caucus. And they have just been absolutely terrific to work with. Actually, just last week, they convened a dinner where they invited their colleagues to meet one another and to break bread and to really have that relationship building moment. And they also invited a bunch of experts, right, who spoke to sort of emerging technology, emerging threats, sort of issues that those two members were interested in. And it was just an opportunity to both educate and engage one another in a way that was rooted in building relationships, but also helped advance the ideas of policy legislation, that like maybe less sexy legislation that can actually get done together. But yeah, Congresswoman Jacobs, Congressman Moore, big fans. If people don't follow them on Twitter right now, you should go ahead and follow them.
I definitely will. I was taking notes as you were just listing that off, and I want to make it clear for the listeners the types of legislation, because I pulled this off of your website and I just want to read this: criminal justice reform, gun violence, entrepreneurship, technology, 21st century skills training, veteran employment, immigration. Like, yeah, in bits and pieces we see some of that jumping up into the national ethos, and we have arguments or disagreements about that. But for the most part, like you said, I think we all can get behind a lot of these things that you're talking about. So I love that. I'm interested, Layla, what pushback do you get, or do you get pushback? I'm sure you do, but what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I think from the member side, at least the members who we reach out to and invite to be a part of this process, people get into public service because they want to solve problems and they want to make things better. And so to the folks who we invite into this space, we don't really get any pushback. People are hungry for the opportunity to start to forge these relationships. Again, it's so easy to stay where you're comfortable in your corner, where you have the people who already agree with you. And it's much more difficult to sort of thrive in spaces where there's conflict. And these leaders understand that they need that. They need that in order to be successful, both politically and personally, right? You don't grow if you're not sort of challenging yourself and building those relationships. And so, from the members who join, I think no pushback at all. I think where we start to run up against some challenges is it's a tough, two challenges really. But narratively, I think the current story, right, is that we are hopelessly polarized, and that there is just no side has any interest in engaging with somebody who has this label of whatever political party it is, because, for whatever list of reasons that you dislike the other party. And I think that narrative sort of is a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the more that you are afraid to engage across the aisle in that way, the less you do it. So the more of an echo chamber you're in, and so the less interest you have in engaging across the aisle, and it sort of is this vicious cycle. And so part of what we hope to do is to create more of the storytelling opportunities to really create, I think, the public demand for the kind of behavior that we're seeing among our members, but we're not seeing at scale across the entire Congress, across an entire state legislature. So sort of building sort of public support is one. The second is sort of existing motivations of, right, like political parties or political leadership. Their job is to get more people with a D or with an R at the end of their name elected. And that's a different motivation than solving a specific problem or passing a particular issue. And so I think sometimes we run up against sort of an issue with leadership, with people who, might not be be on the same page at that moment, who sort of support this idea of collaboration in theory, but sometimes in practice, like that, oh, this isn't the right moment to introduce this bill or to vote on this piece of legislation. And I think sort of our answer to that would be that millennials are about to be in leadership. Right? The more that we can invest in this generation and scale this culture that we're seeing already, the more we can support them as they elevate in their own careers and rise into the leadership ranks, the more that that's going to be a non-issue, that's going to be a non-problem. And no longer are we swimming up against the culture of Congress, but now millennials are setting the culture of Congress. And I think that's the inflection point that we're working towards.
Layla, I got to imagine you come up against frustrations. I got to imagine that power structure that you just described is just, man, some days feels like you're just beating your head against the brick wall. What do you do for yourself in those moments where you do feel that, man, is this ever going to take hold like we want it to take hold? What do you do?
You have to remember that this is a long-term change. Change happens slowly, and then it happens all at once. And change isn't linear. And so I think really taking a step back and celebrating the wins and remembering that a step back is not a nail in a coffin. It is just sort of, you've discovered, I think Ben Franklin said this, right? Like, I've discovered 1,000 ways to fail. That's probably not the quote. I probably like
something along those lines.
But I think that sort of remembering, really taking the time to celebrate the wins and the victories, and not losing sight of the North Star of the long game, I think helps with some of the setbacks and some of the challenging moments. And I think our team is really good at lifting each other up and shouting out when our legislators, when our future caucuses are able to have those wins, have those moments. It's energizing, and it sort of helps smooth over some of the more challenging frustrations.
What's a recent win that you celebrated?
Ooh, a recent win. Okay, well, we this was just in Kansas, actually.
Hey, my home state.
Oh my gosh, I promise I didn't even plan that.
Oh, I didn't tell you.
But the Kansas Future Caucus they wrote and then they passed, and then the governor just signed a bill that expanded access to homeownership for millennials. And it was a bipartisan bill, and we were able to sort of put out like press around it. There was a bill signing ceremony. We did a bunch of fun stuff on social media. And the team really just, we have a Slack channel where like all the emojis, like all the celebrations. And it was just like a moment to come together, not just as a MAP staff, but with the legislators too, sort of co-celebrating in this moment. Like, we got this over the finish line. Like, yes. That was a good one. That was fun.
That's wonderful. I love that. And so glad to hear that happening in my home state. So, you were earlier saying there's a struggle to articulate, or we don't have the vocabulary for what that third lane is. And I want to ask this, Layla, is the two-party system doing us favors? Do you always see that being there, or do we need a third party? Or as we begin to try and figure out the vocabulary there, what do you think the future of that looks like?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a spicy question. I don't see the two-party system going anywhere. I think in general, more competition is good. I think we can talk about the barriers that young candidates have in entering into either of the parties to run competitive races, sort of access to funding and how campaign finance plays into that. But I do think at our core, we have a divisions problem. So even if there were 3 parties or 4 parties, I think the root problem would sort of remain. And so sort of flooding the field with more parties, maybe could help to a certain extent. And then you have like a parliamentary system. But I think until we get to sort of all the way over to that side where you're required to form these coalitions, I think we're better off sort of focusing on how can we make the parties that do exist more inclusive, more able to work on identifying sort of end goals and then working together to get there, rather than sort of this all out war. Because at the end of the day, they're both here to help Americans. They're here to help this country, and you're not helping anyone if you're not finding ways to sort of do that together.
On the topic of getting millennials and younger generations into, like you said, viable candidacy positions, what can be done there? What things are you working on to elevate the ability to even have access to those positions?
Yeah. Well, it starts with education, right? If you don't believe that our institutions can solve problems, then you have literally no interest in being a part of it. You don't want to run for office. You don't want to work for an elected official. Like, you want to be as far away from politics as possible if you think that it is not working. And so part of it is fixing sort of from a structural policy lens, like what are some of the issues that we have that can modernize Congress or that can sort of make our institutions work more effectively. But then how can we actually go into communities and showcase where the opportunities are for real civic engagement? Where can we build that civic muscle so that we're not so skeptical of our democracy and our institutions' ability to solve problems? So first and foremost, I think there's that barrier of just, do I even want to do this? And then once you've made the decision to get involved, then I think, connecting people with, there's a ton of wonderful organizations out there that do sort of young candidate recruitment and training, connecting them to sort of training on constituent engagement or voter outreach. And I think one thing that young people do have going for us is, as digital media and digital communications become more and more important in campaigns, I think we have a real native literacy in digital to do that kind of outreach authentically. I think that has the added benefit of helping bypass some of the really expensive ways of getting on people's radars and some of the costly gatekeepers that are out there to get your message out. So I think we're trending in the right direction, but it starts with really just helping people believe that it's a valuable and worthy path to follow in the first place.
What would I go about Googling, or what would a listener Google to find those organizations that would help a young candidate kind of get up to speed on some of those things you talked about, provided that I do have the faith that the institutions can still work?
Well, you can Google Millennial Action Project, and we'll help connect you to the right organization. And that's partially a joke. But it's also serious because we do partner with some great organizations. And I'll tell you a story. One of our legislators in Mississippi was running this group chat that people from all over Mississippi were getting added to. And he was running it because he was seeing young people run for office and have no clue where to start. Like, where do I go to get my campaign mailers printed? Or how do I even file to run? And he was a Democrat, or he is a Democrat, but he saw this from the left and from the right. And he said, I don't care who you are. If you're a young person, invite whoever to this group chat, and I'm gonna be a resource to you, and I'm gonna help build your capacity. And so I think, if you're not on this group chat in Mississippi, there's lots of more formal organizations. But I think there are, there's a real swell of interest in being supportive to connect young people to the resources they need.
It can be grassroots and grass tops, as I believe you said it earlier.
Here we go. Yeah, exactly. And I will not give out the representative's cell phone number on this podcast. I think
that would be best. Layla, what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I think I wish people framed how they think about politics as a hopeful question and not a how can we get out of this mess, right? I think that the first sort of comes from a place of despair and a deficit mindset. And so I wish people would ask more, what are you hopeful for?
I gotta ask.
I'll answer that.
What are you hopeful for?
Well, I think among young people, we touched on this, but there is an altruism and a desire to do good in the world and to build the world we want to live in that I think it should inspire and give everyone a lot of hope. We partnered with an organization recently who did some polling on millennials and Gen Z. And when they asked them, who do you think will create the change in the world that you want to see? The number one answer was elected officials. And the number two answer was me. Number one, elected officials. Number two, me. And so what that tells me is people still believe in their core in the ability of our democracy to solve problems. And they also believe in themselves. And if that doesn't give you hope about the elected officials of the future and the promise of our democracy to solve real problems, then there's nothing more I can say. But the numbers prove it. Elected officials and me.
Wonderful place to leave it, Layla. Thank you so much. How can people connect with the work that you do, with you? Just where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I plugged our website already, millennialaction.org. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, just type in Millennial Action and it'll pop up. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you. This has been fantastic. I hope you found that conversation to be an encouraging one, that our political situation may not be as divisive and polarized as it appears to be, and it certainly appears that way, but if you listen to Layla right there, things are not as bad as they seem to be, and that is encouraging for me, and I hope it is for you as well. So many thanks to Layla for joining me on the show this week. Please do me and Layla a huge favor and share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Layla that I have on each week, subscribe to the show so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me. It's michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.